very much, Annalika. I'm delighted to see so many people here. This is obviously an incredibly topical issue to discuss at the moment. So fake news, disinformation, and COVID-19 are often mentioned in the same sentence. We want to look at what issues fake news have upon policy implementation and how can fake news be counteracted. We're going to be discussing these with 4 experts who I will introduce shortly. Firstly, I just want to point out that we are recording this meeting, so please just be aware of that if you are asking any questions or if you would prefer not to have your image shared. So disinformation and misinformation around COVID-19 have been described as a sneaky threat. The ubiquity of social media means that we all have the increased possibility of access to multiple media sources, but it is both a boon and a threat. We might not have the capacity to realise that something we're reading might be disinformation or misinformation. And we didn't ask for Ireland to be put into an increased lockdown just to make our topic even more topical at the moment. It really does concentrate our minds somewhat on the issues of fake news around COVID-19. The ubiquity and the complexity of medical, social, political, and cultural responses to COVID-19 shows the significance of reliable communication around pandemics, but also allows us to think about policy responses and how in-depth and robust they should be. So the format of today's talk is that each speaker is going to talk for anything between 12 and 20 minutes. We will leave questions for each of the speakers until the end so we can get an overall perspective. I do want to point out as well and to promote the Dublin Law and Politics Review. The first issue was incredibly successful. The second issue has a paper deadline for the 30th of October. So if you have materials you have ready to go and you want to get them peer reviewed and submitted for publication with a really nice group of editors, then please do submit them. The address for the email address can be shared in the chat at some stage, and it's also available on the Facebook page. So to introduce the speakers in the order that they will speak as well. First, we're going to have Barbara Gormley. She's currently completing her PhD as an IRC scholar in Dublin City University on crisis and risk communication models during pandemics. She has a BSc in physiology and an MA in PR from TU Dublin, and she's worked in PR and marketing executive roles. She currently lectures on the MSc in Science and Health Communication in DCU and guest lectures in PR at TU Dublin. Then we are going to have Fritz Siregar, who is the head of the Electoral Commission in Indonesia and is also in charge of supervising fake news on social media in Indonesia. He will be discussing fake news from a policy and governmental perspective. He's a lecturer, an election observer, and as he describes himself, a lifetime student. He's affiliated with both the Indonesia Jakarta School of Law and the University of New South Wales. Then we're going to have Dr. Eileen Culloty, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the DCU Institute for Future Media and Journalism, where she leads research on countering disinformation as part of the Horizon 2020 Project Provenance. She is investigating how to use information supports to challenge false beliefs and dissuade people from sharing disinformation. Her co-authored book with Dr. Jane Souter, Disinformation and Manipulation in Digital Media, will be published by Routledge in December. And I'm incredibly impressed that anyone has been able to concentrate their minds during the Irish lockdown to actually produce a book as well. Finally, our last speaker, who is not here yet but will be joining us in about half an hour, is Ethan Shattock. He's a PhD researcher at Maynooth University who specialises in fake news, elections and censorship laws. He is published in this area, so altogether we're going to have a really interesting discussion. As I said, I will give the speakers a warning when they're getting close to their 20 minutes, but otherwise we will just give them the floor. So first off, we have Barbara.
Hello, Marie.
Hi, Barbara. Do you want to go ahead? You have the floor now.
Yeah, I will. I'll just explain from the beginning that I'm a bit of a joker in the pack, simply because the other people that have kindly joined us today are very much involved in fake news, etc. And I have been invited by Marie because my speciality is crisis and risk communication. So I'm going to talk in general because of the week that's in it around mixed messaging and gaps in messaging, etc. So I'll just explain that my research is on crisis and risk communication models during pandemics. I was originally studying responses, which were key persons involved, namely journalists, scientists, and professional communicators, in how messages were put out there during the H1N1 swine flu pandemic. But I've had to include a little known virus that was behaving like it was not seasonal flu in January or February of this year in China, called SARS-CoV-2, which is the official name of the virus, whose symptoms are manifested as COVID-19. I just wanted to say that being active and informed in this domain, it was common knowledge that in the peripatetic and congested world we live in, and the rise of novel infectious diseases since the 1980s onwards, indicated the likelihood of an occurrence of a global pandemic being every 10 years. So I had been originally studying the swine flu pandemic, and I know that the first case was declared by the Minister for Health in Ireland in May of 2009 on the 8th of May. So I had my yearly diary open this year, and it actually penned in, "We are due a pandemic." And it would seem when you're talking to people that, yes, this is a novel infection, there's very little known about, there's huge amount of uncertainty. But I will explain later on that when it comes to pandemic communications, they're kind of tried and tested, and very much there is a lot of knowledge and lessons learned, because I particularly advocate the CERC model, which is crisis emergency risk communication, which gives us a toolbox of how we should respond during pandemics. So, but why is communication so important in a public health emergency such as a pandemic? Peters, who wrote the little book of pandemics, which you can avail of online, you can buy online, and it's actually a very nice little book about telling you about responses and very much centered on pandemic communication. It's pocket size as well, so it's very handy, and it's also very informative. And he discusses the importance of pandemic communication, stating that if and not when, when and not if, pardon me, that the global pandemic will next occur. So he's talking about this in 2012. And in that occurrence, a vaccine will be any nation's first line of defense. And the second, undoubtedly, will be communication. Effective communication is a fundamental necessity during any public health emergency, such as a pandemic, as government bodies rely on many channels, including traditional media, to relay accurate and important health messages for the containment and control of the disease. At the same time, public interest and demand for information rises as people need clear and timely answers to important and often complex questions. They need this information in order to confine their fears and also gain instructions that hopefully lead to positive health outcomes. This is the first global pandemic of the digital media age. The accessibility of communication channels and platforms presents the public with a lot of conflicting information, of which they must evaluate the science. More than ever before, we are in critical need of knowledge that allows us to identify the nature of information we are surrounded by, as that information fundamentally could save our lives. Health authorities face the challenge of communicating clearly and effectively to a public that is fatigued by restrictions, confused by what's considered the new normal, and saturated with COVID-19 media. For communication researchers like me, this amplifies how the pandemic is teaching us that communicating in a crisis and risk situation is a highly challenging thing to do. It comes as no surprise that the issue of mixed messaging has been pervasive since the lifting of the restrictions over the summer months. If we cast our minds back 6 months ago to March, at the height of the lockdown restrictions, the messages underlying the short-term emergency response were straightforward. You stay at home and don't leave the house except to perform essential work or to avail of essential services such as food shopping. Regardless of how hard these restrictions were to bear, the message was clear and galvanised by a collective responsibility to keep each other safe. Being in this together gave us a clear goal and purpose where we were contributing to flattening the curve. This message struck a chord with the Irish public, who got on board and adopted preventative measures such as social norms and social distancing that resulted in slowing down the spread of the virus. The goal of reducing the pressure on our healthcare system was achieved. Skip ahead then to the summer months as the numbers of daily infections and mortalities decreased, and we moved towards easing the restriction measures and reopening our economy and society. The biggest challenge became getting a consistent message to the public concerning their options around dealing and living with a virus that was still circulating and infectious, albeit invisible. The message had now changed to, you must take personal responsibility and evaluate and determine risk. People who wouldn't usually assess risk on a daily basis on a very conscious and intense level were left to make critical decisions. They did this by combining various inputs, such as emerging science around the virus, if they were aware of it or even others understood it, the advice of people they know and trust, i.e. peer review, and their own values and priorities. A good analogy of this risk self-assessment awkward situation would be, it was like asking everyone to decide their own speed limit and the consequences of that. Pandemics are not a new phenomenon, and I've already said that, and communications research in the area came into its own during the SARS epidemic in China in 2002. It became obvious that communication disasters on behalf of the Chinese government had hampered the containment of the spread due to serious mistrust in government messaging. Based on lessons learned and best practice, crisis and emergency risk communication, or CERC, provides an evidence-based framework and best practices for anyone who communicates on behalf of an organisation responding to a public health emergency such as a pandemic. Risk communication is defined as how health risk messages are relayed to the public and how the audience reacts to them. When people are confronted with risk, a genuine emotional, behavioural and cognitive response is elicited, and these responses must be acknowledged and dealt with in any communications about a potential threat. Crisis communication, on the other hand, is more acute and the information reaction as the event is unfolding and in the immediate aftermath. Combined, effective crisis and risk communication in a health emergency can preserve or win public trust by knowing what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. The translation of scientific knowledge into simple information that non-technical audience can understand and act on underpins risk communication research. And the reason why this is so important is that faulty risk perceptions may hamper communications because people may not understand or misinterpret scientific or problematic information. So what are the tenets of risk communication models? Well, the mental noise theory holds that when people are stressed or upset, they are dealing with a great deal of internal mental noise and are less able to react to information from outside the way they should. Given the level of negativity and uncertainty surrounding pandemics, the likelihood is high that people will respond extremely emotionally. A second tenet of risk communication is that when people are upset, they often do not trust authority. Linked to this is the idea called trust determination, which means that when people are distressed, they often become distrustful and are less likely to accept that the communication is real and true. A third tenet called negative dominance theory holds that when people are upset, they are more likely to listen to negative rather than positive reports and give greater weight to negativity as opposed to positive information. Understanding a lay audience cognitive beliefs about risk is also a concern to risk communication researchers. The logic is that if popular interpretations of reality are understood, then risk communicators will be able to translate technical and scientific concepts into understandable messages. This is called a mental models approach. Lay people's understanding of risks are explored using in-depth interviews. Information gathered from them interviews is then used to tailor and focus health risk messages in a similar way to audience research in social marketing. So how do we overcome how people process risk and tailor messages accordingly? As said, when people are bombarded with negative information, they tend to focus on the adverse outcomes as opposed to the positives. Messaging should focus on what is being done as opposed to what is not being done and provide solution-based approaches. Because one person's idea of careful in a pandemic is different from another's, the most helpful instructions are those that are clear, specific, and easily repeatable. Otherwise, people are likely to come to different conclusions based on similar information. Successful communication depends on credibility and trust, and I cannot say that enough. Effective emergency communication requires an understanding of target audiences' differing needs, perceptions, and characteristics, i.e., segmenting your audiences and tailoring your messages accordingly. In putting together and disseminating messages, careful consideration should always be given to cultural components of your audience segments. To prioritize information needs, consider audience relationship to the actual emergency event. Delivering short, action-based messages and strategizing to build credibility and trust impacts the effectiveness of your messaging. Essential tools such as audience analysis, feedback, and message testing allow you to adapt messages so that they are clearly understood and received by your audiences. Relevant, credible, and culturally appropriate messaging in an emergency offers audiences the information they need to make life-saving decisions. It's absolutely important to highlight concerns around high risk and dangerous activities, but the appraisals, particularly concerning young people and compliance, may better be served by giving people options and informing their decisions instead of telling them directly what to do. You need to put yourself in their shoes, be present and listen on the platforms they engage with to know what they are thinking. Addressing what people are feeling and the challenges they face builds trust and rapport. Furthermore, messaging and solutions should be informed and achieved by public engagement through market research and polls. Trust and credibility come with an accurate, open, and empathetic approach to risk and crisis communications. Professing that not all your strategies and preparations are going to be exacting and that lessons have been learned further increases credibility. Social distancing measures have taken their toll on routines, mental health, and the nation's economy by becoming an upsetting but essential norm in saving lives and limiting illness. We are facing into 6 weeks of lockdown measures again, where the tenet of collectivism, that we were in this together, that was so fundamental to the success of the first lockdown, seems weary and out of touch now. With case numbers alarmingly rising and the highest restriction measures being enacted, complacency, fatigue, and a lack of compliance has rebounded us into full lockdown again. It's the effective communication of the simple messages like reducing your contacts and hand hygiene are what we so desperately need now to reduce the spread and avoid the worst outcome. The government's anticipated medium-term plan for the way forward was released in September this year and was received with both confusion at the delivery and content, with sadly only 3 pages of the 70-page plan dedicated to their way forward communication strategy. Although comprehensive, it said it took an outside source, a national newspaper, an hour for a designer to communicate the lengthy document in an understandable infographic table. We have had restriction newspaper leaks, talk of discord among senior politicians and members of the advisory team, the health advisory team, NEFIT, and gaps in communication where people are clamouring for information in order to assess risk or prepare for further restrictions. Without doubt, the emphasis now should be on communicating feasible timelines with a clear sense of why the decisions around the restrictions we face or will have to face have reached a timely consensus as opposed to sudden changes. And that's what transparent communication looks like. We are 7 months into this pandemic now, and we have learned just how difficult people find assessing their own risk and how leaving people in an information vacuum erodes trust. The communication, especially around possible exit strategies in 6 weeks' time, i.e. the lifting of restriction, needs to be clear, concise and timely. These reassurances, as well as giving people and sticking to a feasible plan, a goal and a vision of a future with hope, could affirm a united effort while going some way to improving social distancing practices and the return to social norms we so desperately need now to contain the virus. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was really interesting. Particularly, I want to take issue, apologies. I want to take issue with you saying that you're the outsider here. You're fundamental and foundational to the discussions that are going on. I'm aware, Barbara, that you did have a slide, and I know you didn't get to put it up. Apologies. If you want to share it for a moment while the next speaker is getting ready, you can please do so. Next, we're going to have Fritz Siregar, who is going to take the floor. Thank you very much, Barbara, for giving us the really interesting and comprehensive overview. And I have lots of questions, but I will give the floor to the audience instead at the end. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Maria, and thank you, everybody. Hello, my name is Fritz. I am from Jakarta, Indonesia, and it's my pleasure to able to meet with you all. And currently, I am the member of Election Oversight Agency, and also as part of my former job also as a constitutional law lecturer at Indonesia Jentera School of Law. Because his appointment for 5 years, so I'm not working as lecturer anymore, but now I am as the member of Election Oversight Agency. So as the Election Oversight Agency, as the introduction is, Indonesia has 3 government branches that govern or participate in organize the election. First, Election Commission. The second, Election Oversight Agency is us. And also the third is Ethical Council for election organizer. So there are 3 branches. So our institutions is government organizations. We are permanent from the national level, provincial level, until also regency city level. And also we have the officer until the cities, regencies, villages, and also at the polling stations. All the polling station, we have the Election Oversight Agency. So our role is to supervise election from the start of the elections until the end, from the voter registrations, the candidate registrations, campaign, logistic, and also the voting process, recapitulation, and also until the determination of the candidate, all the presidents, and also the parliament. So the job is all from the beginning is our process to supervise. The meaning of to supervise is not only to give the recommendation to election committee, but also to adjudicated administrative violation, election administrative violations, also to the criminal violations during the election process. So when we start our office in 2017, we just finished the governor elections, Jakarta governors, and during that time we learned that the hoax and the fake news is spread around in social media. And when we start the job and we have to start to prepare 2018 local election, there are 180 local election across in Indonesia. We are looking around and who is really the one that govern the social media? How we control the social media and also the fake news that spread in the social media. And we learned that there is none. There is only the platform that focusing how to supervise or try to take actions about the fake news. So they start the story of us, of the Election Oversight Agency, that we start to work with the platform, we start to work with the Minister of the Informations, we are gathered with the club of the government institutions there to supervise the fake news. We have tried to work how to determine the fake news and how to determine the hate speech, for example, because hate speech in one area is also different with the other area. And how to adjudicate, how to bring people that spread the fake news to the court, and whether to bring the one that create the fake news to the court. Of course, there is a process, and of course the relation with the relation with the platform is not always smooth during that time, because sometimes they need the clarification about what is the fake news. So during our I think it's almost from 2017 until now. I think almost 3 years that we are working how to combat with the fake news, also in the hate speech in the social media. Of course, how our staff doing the cyber patrol, how we are working with the Minister of the Information. They have their program that able to get all the fake news in the social media, and how we working with the society, because they are the one that debugging, or they make the label this is a fake news or not. And for this year, 2020, we gonna have the local elections. So we're gonna have 270 local election, 9 governor and 261 mayor, and also the head of the regency. So we start, the process is already start in the January, and we supposed to have the election day on 23rd of September. But because of the COVID, we are postponed for 3 months, and we're gonna have the election day on 9 December. Of course, you know the challenges that we having, whether we're gonna have the election for this year or not, because the pandemic is still here with us. In around the world for 2020, there are 71 countries that has election agenda. As you know, US is one of it. There's a South Korea, there's some Germany, France, and Australia, and also Indonesia. So from 71 countries, 31 countries, including Indonesia and US, we are still conducting the election for this year. Of course, with some modification. There are election modification that we get. And during, of course, that this process, the fake news is always spread across the social media about the health of the candidacy, or election commissioner is get positive and the election get cancelled, or it is not safe going to the polling stations because polling station is full of the positive, or you will lose your right to vote because if you are if you are positive, or that sort of the fake news is also already spread when we decided to continue to conduct the election this year. So because this is our third experience for the 3 consecutive years, so we have local election 2018 to elect 180 head of regency. 2019 we have the big election that we have to have the parliament and also to have the presidential election. This is our third year to conduct it, the local election that we have to elect 270 local elections. What we learn during this process. I mean, I am focusing about how to conducting the fake news in the election and the COVID. So what we learned is during this process that we cannot 100% eliminate all the fake news that happen in the social media, because some parties they get advantages because spreading the fake news. There are bad actors that always have the capability, that the intention to doing and share the fake news. But we do, as the regulatory and also as the election oversight agency, is first we are lucky that we have a quite close relations with the platform, with the Facebook and in also with the Instagram. So when we during the patrol that we got this the fake news, so we communicate with them that also they need to be removed as soon as possible, or we put label that this is a fake news, or this is not true, or this is already it is already hoax. We also working with the Minister of the Informations during their system, because with their system they have the system the capability to search all the fake news that happen in the social media, and we are sit together that this is a fake news and this is not a fake news, and we have to put the label, or they have to take down from the platform. So in our policy with regard to the how to handling the fake news, first the cooperation between among government institution is a must, because everybody has their systems to doing the patrol. And also the second is to inform the public how to be careful before they share something, because according to our criminal law, if you share something that you know or you do not know this is a fake news, is fall to the is criminal charges. And we have cases that the one that shared the fake news is already being to the court. It gives the deterrent effect to the people. And also the third, public participation, to ask them. There is always possibility for them also to report the fake news. There is the people is like to forget that there are three dot on the right top that people, and at every post that they can able to also they are self reporting about the fake news. But the most important things that I learned during my job to supervise the social media and also the election is the response from the government about the fake news. Because when something happen, when there is a news, the response, the public or the government in institution itself, it need to step up and say, no, this is wrong. No, this is not true. Or give the counter argument about the fake news that arose during that time period. And the counter is sometimes it's not really during the countering the fake news. Sometimes we cannot use the what I call it the normal official channel. There is no time for me to write a letter to Minister Information and the Minister Information direct that letter to the Director General to respond that news. Uh, the time is very short. That is why the phone call, the need for them to also need to respond, the clarification about it is a news about the fake news. It is needed, because what we learned during that process, we cannot let the fake news spread, even though we know that maybe this already spread. But when there is a counter arguments about one thing that happened, it able to make the people understands, then they can see that there is a fake news and there is not a fake news. Now in Indonesia, as I mentioned that we're gonna have the local election on 9th of December, 734 candidates with 105 million registered voters. The campaign is already start from 26th of September until 14th of December. The campaign is already started right now. And as the election oversight agencies, what we do in every 10 days, we give the report, accumulate about how many activities a campaign that has been done, because the town hall meeting, some, even though with several restrictions is still there, or the meeting that conducted by the candidate, and the number of the people that gain positive and gain the negative with that period. This is one way of us to inform that the campaign is there, the campaign is already conducted, even though with strict protocols, but we have to inform the public that there is the relation with up and the down of the number of the people that get the positive. So the people know that yes, there is a campaign, but there is campaign with many activities, but the number of that regional level is going green, what we call it, when it's going down is this is the number of the people that gain positive or gain being is going to a negative. So it's part of the accountability to inform the public. Yes, we are in the campaign process. Yes, we are trying to put with the strict health the protocol, but we also to inform the public that the number of the positive and the negative, the people that get infected. So they have the idea. They need to hear from the one that has the authority about the election process, not from whoever there, from the bad actor that share the news in the social media. So this our story. So maybe we can have more discussion during the question and answer. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much, Fritz. That was really interesting. I have a few links about things that I'm thinking about in the connections, but of course we're going to save questions till the end as well. There's one or two coming in through the chat as well. And thank you for that and for all your hard work in the area as well. I know Indonesia is a fantastic example because the scale of the elections and the size of Indonesia and the population compared to somewhere like Ireland is a really interesting counterpoint. Okay, next we are going to have Eileen, Dr. Eileen Culloty presenting. So thank you, Eileen.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to get my slides here. So I hope you can all see that okay. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the Provenance project that I work on and how we're approaching countering disinformation, and then focus a little more on COVID-19. So first of all, online disinformation is a really complex problem because there are so many different overlapping factors that influence how it's created, how it's shared, and the impact that it has on audiences and on politics. But we can reduce it to its basic constituents and think of it as a process that involves different actors in different stages. So I'm not saying that this is the ideal model, but it's reducing it to its most basic level so that we can begin to try and understand it and what can be done about it. So first we have these bad actors who create and push online disinformation, and they can do this at scale by using bots or targeted advertising. And we have the online platforms that incentivize low quality content. So they incentivize clickbait. The whole ad tech system that underpins online advertising and platforms' business models funds disinformation. But then the final component is audiences. And I think this is actually the most important part, because if you could study all of the online content that's created that's fake or is dubious, that wouldn't tell you anything about whether it's had an impact. In fact, an awful lot of online disinformation doesn't go anywhere because nobody engages with it. So it's really only becomes a problem when audiences are willing to engage with it by responding, by sharing it, by passing it along to their friends. And one of the values of breaking disinformation down into this process is that you can then start to think about countermeasures and policy proposals as attempts to intervene in the process. So for example, to counteract bad actors, we need to improve techniques for detecting fake content. To change the culture of online platforms, we need to increase transparency around content, but also reduce incentives like the ad tech business model. And then to support audiences, we need to give them a more information supports, help them make better decisions, increase media literacy so that they can make more informed decisions for themselves while they're browsing. And in the Provenance project, we really focus on this audience component. So our idea is to create a moment of pause or intervene before people react, because so much of social media is based on instant reactions. And then disinformation actors or bad actors produce emotionally manipulative content that's designed to make you angry or fearful so that you do react instantly. So the idea is to create this friction or pause that might, it's not going to solve the problem, but it might reduce the visibility of disinformation. And then over time, it might upskill audiences so that they will be less likely to engage with it. So there are many different moving parts to the project. It's a big multidisciplinary project with partners across Europe, but in essence, the idea is to develop detection algorithms that will automatically evaluate online content, so on social media or on the web, and then provide a visual summary of what we know about a piece of content to the end user. And crucially, we do not want to become the judges of content. We don't want to tell people what to think or what to believe. We just want to provide them with enough background information to make an informed decision for themselves. So on the detection algorithm side, we have partners in the Czech Republic who specialize in detecting visual manipulation. So detecting if content has been tampered with, or if a piece of visual content is a deep fake. We also have colleagues in Trinity College who are focused on textual content. So here they were looking at, if you study disinformation content, what type of language does it use? And how does that differ, say, from a standard news report? If a fake story goes out, so a story that's invented something, often they invent a process or they invent a claim that a politician has never made, you can compare that with what's being reported on the news wires and let people know that this claim is not being reported anywhere else. So maybe you should be suspicious about it and maybe you should check it out. So this is the initial prototype, and it's very much an initial prototype. As you can see, there hasn't been much design expertise applied to it yet, but the idea is pretty simple. It's a 3-level process. Everything is highly visual to make it easy and fast for people to understand. So on level 1, a person would see an icon in the corner of the social media post or on the web page that they're looking at. And if we think there is a reason to be suspicious, it will have a little red exclamation mark. They can then click into that to find out more about it. We've broken it down into different categories. So general information about when did this content first appear online, who is the source of it, and the original source, because something might be shared along a chain and you no longer know where it originally came from. The source comparison that I was just explaining. So if there's a story about Kim Jong-un being dead, is the New York Times reporting that? Is the BBC reporting that? Or is that only appearing on this unknown news service? And then information about the image and the language used. And then on the final level, level 3, so if the person wants to click in further, then we provide an explanation for why we have put these warning levels on it. And this is where we will explain common disinformation strategies, why we think this piece of content might be a piece of manipulation. And that's where we hope that audiences would learn more about the content they're consuming. So this is very much based on evidence, but research on online disinformation and how to counter it is in its infancy. So there's a huge amount that we don't know. But there is a consensus emerging around certain approaches that appear to be generally very effective. And the first is called accuracy priming. And it's quite simple that if you ask people to think about the accuracy of something just for a moment, their ability to discern disinformation increases massively. So again, that goes back to the idea that so much content we consume is done instantly. You're just instantly clicking or flicking through. But if you stop just for a moment to think, is this plausible? Is this credible? People's ability to detect disinformation greatly increases. A second area that there's a lot of consensus around is the idea of inoculation. So it means if you explain to people what are the common strategies through which bad actors try to manipulate them, then when they see those strategies, they will recognize them and reject them in future. So if you tell people that disinformation actors will often try to manipulate your emotions and make you fearful and angry, well, then they'll recognize that when they see it. And although there's a lot of consensus that those 2 strategies are very effective, there is still an awful lot we don't know. So one of the problems in general in all efforts to counter disinformation and understand it is that the online platforms share very little data with researchers or public authorities. So we don't really know the full scale of it. And then an awful lot of research tends to be conducted in North America and in Europe. So there isn't a global research picture. So something that might be very effective for one group of people in one context might not actually be effective for another. And I think this underpins one of the difficulties, or in a way it underpins a lot of the inequalities that we find in research generally, or in platforms responses generally. They focus on the US in particular, and to a lesser extent Europe, and then the rest of the world tends to be ignored. So thinking about COVID-19 in particular, when this crisis began, there was this huge explosion of false claims and rumors and scams, but it was incredibly diverse. So while we use the term disinformation or fake news as a catch-all term, once you start to look at the types of contents that were created about COVID, it becomes much harder to conclusively say, well, that's a piece of disinformation. So for example, there were initially a lot of just rumors about healthcare advice, advising people about things they should do, or people were sharing hoaxes about an imminent lockdown. But it's not clear that any of those people, or a lot of those people, were doing that on purpose. They didn't intend to deceive. And the definition of disinformation that the European Commission follows is that it's the intention to deceive others with false information. So that intentionality aspect is actually quite difficult to prove. But another aspect, I think, of COVID, and why it was really not that surprising that there was so many false claims, is that the entire crisis was surrounded by scientific uncertainty. And in many ways, we still have that scientific uncertainty. So it was a new virus where very little was known about it. As a consequence of that, scientists were disagreeing about what the right approach was, and they changed their minds. So if you remember back in, I think, March or April, at one point, the WHO was saying that ibuprofen was perfectly fine, you should take ibuprofen. Then maybe a month later, they changed their stance on whether you should be taking ibuprofen or not. And it's simple things like that are perfectly acceptable and to be expected in the case of a new virus. But in the context of a public that's quite panicked and wants answers, that kind of scientific uncertainty can undermine their trust in reliable information. And we know this from research on climate change as well. Any hint of scientific uncertainty can lead people to reduce their trust in science and start to look at alternative sources. And then the final point is just that the pandemic itself created this enormous social and psychological upheaval. So people wanted answers. So they wanted to know, when will there be a vaccine? What is the most effective way for them to protect themselves and their families? And when those answers aren't there, and when life has been turned upside down, conspiracy theories tend to flourish. That's happened throughout history. And it's quite striking that the 5G conspiracy theory, if you remember, which really peaked back in March, just the rollout of 5G happened to coincide with the coronavirus hitting Europe and North America. But every major new communications technology tends to be accompanied by these types of conspiracy theories. So when I was younger, it was microwave ovens are going to cause cancer. Or when mobile phones were first introduced, there was a lot of conspiracy theories about that they would reduce male fertility and so on. And then those theories, they just die away. So unfortunately, we had a global pandemic that coincided with the rollout of a new technology, and that just became an enormous breeding ground for disinformation and conspiracy theories. I just want to highlight one kind of small thing that we did in the Fuzhou Institute, and it was almost funny in that on the one hand, we're working on this big European project that's got lots of computer scientists and psychologists and something called blockchain, which I still don't understand what that is exactly, but it's got all of those really impressive technologies behind it. And one of the very concrete things we did was actually very simple and was done in PowerPoint and Microsoft Word. So back in March, we were in contact with Age Action, and they said they were getting massive amounts of calls from older people who were not just extremely concerned about COVID and the cocooning and the fear of getting the virus, but also all the information that they were seeing. So because of cocooning, and a lot of older people were going onto WhatsApp for the first time, or maybe their families were giving them tablets and smartphones, and they had they hadn't built up the skills with how to use this. So we worked with Age Action and Media Literacy Ireland and NALA, the National Adult Literacy Agency, to create one of their Getting Started guides. So our specific guide was how to avoid false information about COVID-19. And so these are just two excerpts from it. So one of the key things was to reinforce, first of all, reliable information sources. So tell them this is where you go for reliable information. So the HSE, the WHO, but also just local radio. So listen to your local radio, check what the news is saying, and don't trust something that you've just been sent on a WhatsApp. But then 3 simple steps are identify the source. So if you're sent something, who has actually sent this to you? What is the source for the claim? Do you recognize it? And then we also provided a simple explanation of the different types of false information. So things like rumors. So you ask yourself, is this based on an official source? If hoaxes about the lockdowns, and I don't know if many of you came across these, but there were an awful lot of hoaxes that were done on, again, simple PowerPoint manipulation technologies where they just took the logo of the WHO or the HSE and just forwarded and sent it on to people, and they were hoaxes or they were scams. Oh, I should add actually, this Age Action project was very small, very simple, but it was an incredible example of different sectors coming together. So RTE and Mary Kennedy filmed these segments and they put it on the afternoon show, and then they had, Age Action had those videos, so they could, instead of people reading it, they could watch the videos to get the explanation. So Age Action itself provided the expertise on what older people need. NALA provided expertise on how do you communicate a message really clearly for people who might have literacy difficulties, for people who might have visual impairments or other disabilities that makes it difficult for them to understand. And as researchers, we tend to write in very long-winded, complicated ways, which is of no use at all to somebody who's struggling with technology. And then through Media Literacy Ireland, we were able to promote these through a massive network of 150 different organizations in different sectors. And as I said, RTE was one of them that came on board to film segments and promote it further. And why this is important, I think, is that disinformation itself is a really complex problem, and there is no simple solution. No single action is going to be effective. And what this is a very small example of is a whole of society approach, where you have expertise from different sectors coming together, resources from different sectors coming together to actually do something really useful. So I think to end, I'll just come back to the high level group on fake news in 2016. These are the key recommendations that came out of their report. And I think these are still as valid now as they were when that report was done. Because there's a tendency, I think, to talk about disinformation countermeasures as though one simple thing is going to be the magic bullet. There is no magic bullet. We need lots of different actions. Some of them will be small targeted actions like fact checking or that Age Action example I just showed you. But really we need longer term actions at the same time, like improving media literacy, looking at the regulation of platforms and increasing their liability for content. Empowering journalists and making sure that the news media sector remains viable. Because while COVID-19 on the one hand produced this huge volume of disinformation, another impact was that the advertising for news media collapsed because of course the businesses were closed, so there was no point in them advertising. So at a point when people most needed news media, those news media were not making any money. So countering disinformation has much broader work than simply responding to that false claim that you see online. So that is my presentation.
Thank you very much, Eileen, for that. That's fascinating. What I'm particularly interested in as well for yours is you're bringing up in your coverage of the role of public service media. I know TV and radio, because there's been a lot of focus and we tend to associate fake news with the platforms, and I have a number of questions around the platforms, but of course the radio and shock radio still does as well have a significant role. And your final point about how advertising underpins our public service media is like, it's quietly devastating, I think, is that, you know, the way we get our news and the way we run our democracy and the way we're informed for democratic processes is so linked to commodification and to advertising it's very much a question for another day, I think, and it would be really interesting to do a panel on that and the role of public service media. But for now, I know we're not talking about that, and I'll save my questions. Okay, now we have Ethan. I'm delighted Ethan can join us. He is straight from teaching, so I hope he's not too tired and that he will be able to give us a good presentation as well. Ethan, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Maria. I'll just try and share my screen now if possible. Hopefully you can all see it.
Yes, thank you, we can.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, tying into the last point there and the overall point, I think, from Eileen's presentation is that this is an issue which is complex and doesn't necessarily involve one catch-all solution, either in relation to intermediaries, which are a big part of the conversation, but also I think in a kind of public sector and kind of legal oversight function too. I'm talking today about, I guess, kind of censoring fake news and censorship as an issue in relation to COVID-19 fake news and what's involved there. I think it kind of ties into what I kind of see as a probably an increasingly important but still somewhat kind of underprobed relationship between free expression in a legal context and a constitutional context and regulating harmful content online. I think part of the difference is that obviously disinformation, unlike certain other areas like content which promotes terrorism or other legal forms, it actually isn't necessarily illegal in many cases. So that's where part of the confusion comes from in terms of anticipating and shaping new legislation. So I think in relation to that, again, I feel like in some ways I'm probably laboring a point here, but it still is a kind of stubborn thing that won't go away. There is definitional ambiguity in relation to this problem. And I was talking to a cybersecurity expert a few days ago. He mentioned that I hate hearing this term fake news. And I mean, it's fine. It's a well-used term. And I think that it's in the kind of popular media, and it has been. And in many cases, it's impossible to avoid that term being used because some actors on a political level are very fond of using it for harmful purposes. But I think that ultimately there is a need for, certainly in a kind of regulatory context and a, I guess, election oversight context, to make sure that you're actually using circumscribed terminology. I think that if you're using wide-ranging technology or terminology such as fake news, it causes problems in terms of regulation, because ultimately fake news refers to, by many measures of definitional studies and that kind of stuff, a number of different things. It can involve things like harmful, unintentional, and deliberate disinformation. It can refer to false and spurious claims in relation to COVID and public health online. It can refer to satire and parody, though, which in many cases, by a number of studies, have shown that it actually has a positive impact on democratic engagement and can actually influence the electorate in a pretty educational and positive way. But I think that, you know, despite the distinction between misinformation, which is mistake in many cases and could be intentionally harmless at least, or not intentional at the very least, and disinformation, which is more deceptive by design, I think that it's also important to know that there are distinctions in the human rights context in cases involving free expression by the ECTHR in Strasbourg. There has been numerous admissions that free expression under Article 10 is meant to protect different things to different degrees. And there isn't meant to be a whole lot of scope for censorship, if you will, or restrictions on content which is deemed satire or a parody. In many cases, it can be positive, and therefore it's important to avoid, in any kind of legal process, having a catch-all attempt. I think that's kind of linked to having a catch-all term and needs to be avoided, I think, so far and going forward. And focus on, I try to use the term EDO, electoral disinformation online, because I'm trying to focus on at least narrowing the framework and terminology down to what is deceptive by design, what is intentional, and yes, as many cases I mentioned in the last presentation, funded, because it actually provides scope for a link tangibly towards fixing issues in the current framework for regulating political ads, especially on digital context. I've had a kind of a selection of legal acts in the last few years that have been introduced, really in the last 3 years. And I've included some recent acts, some COVID-related legal acts. I think on a certain level, though to different degrees, these could be classified as censorial acts, I think. A few years ago in Germany, there was a NetzDig, the Network Enforcement Act. Again, it's definitely oriented towards intermediaries and platforms. And in a certain sense, it isn't necessarily what you'd call a fake news law. It's geared towards restricting or taking down certain content, which is harmful or unlawful, or as the legislation says, manifestly unlawful. And it actually gives statutory time limits for certain companies to do so. In Malaysia, it's an example of a more kind of harsh law, which is a very wide definition of fake news. You can see it there, any information which is wholly or partly false or fictitious, whether in any kind of form. It's quite a wide-ranging term. It resulted in the, I guess, premature and ill-thought-out prosecution of a citizen from Denmark who criticized the arrival of the police to a certain incident. He said he criticized them for coming late and was arrested, and they brought criminal sanctions for doing so. Kenya, similar legislation under the kind of broader purview of cybercrimes. Again, these have all kind of elicited condemnation from rights organizations and free expression organizations, hence the link between these legislative moves and a scope for censorship. Singapore too, and actually increasingly, or more recently rather, in the COVID context, there was a decision in India which the court actually advised the central government to mandate that certain media outlets verify information with the government before posting it out there. So Hungary more recently is a more kind of popular and publicized version of that. I think the sanctions for the Hungarian legislation on the basis of COVID fake news or false information, I think they actually can exceed on a certain level the statutory criminal sanctions for defamation. So some of these things aren't wholly bad. Germany, for example, they do try to incorporate transparency into how platforms manage, oversee, and permanently address harmful content on their platforms. So there definitely is scope for, you know, some kind of positive steps in this area, but ultimately, I think part of the source of consternation from my point of view and different people too is when you introduce sanctions that are criminal in nature and punitive, and in some cases just excessive, that causes confusion and I think could, you know, provide scope for a chilling effect on free expression. And these things are quite linked here. And you can tell from the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg that, you know, traditionally there's been a kind of wide preference for, especially in a political and electoral context, to have a robust exchange of free ideas and political debate. In different decisions, there's been a scope for having a wider margin of appreciation in terms of member states to regulate and kind of restrict things that are harmful and discriminatory and could cause violence. But ultimately, in a political context, there's been quite a wide and robust deference towards having a kind of laissez-faire in some ways view towards free expression. I think though that a lot of these cases were made and decided upon before social media. So I think now what you're recognizing and characterizing disinformation as in its current incarnation is not just false information on a case-by-case basis, but it's more systemic, more structured, more funded, and more oriented towards subverting democratic values, and in doing so can harm human rights too. So I think I'm trying to kind of analyze this from this necessarily delicate but interrelated balance of linked and in some cases conflicting human rights, especially, for example, the right to free expression versus the right to free elections. But I think increasingly, and sorry, what COVID really shows is that I think public health is a really important part of this that increasingly is visibly impaired by disinformation in a harmful context. Public health too is running through the Convention on Human Rights and is really important to protect and can on certain grounds justify interference with free expression. This is part of the confusion. I think that COVID shows that it can harm more than just kind of rights to free elections, but also can impair in certain contexts. It can cause perhaps civil unrest and can damage public health, can undermine confidence, crucially, in established public health organizations and that are entrusted with kind of giving down important information. I think that in that sense, it's probably a test that because of, in part, the lack of action to be effective from platforms, and in some cases, the complicity from platforms. I mean, Facebook's researchers showed that they actually contributed to polarizing and fostering these kind of divisive echo chambers in the last few years. It's linked to their kind of algorithmic structure. So in light of that, it probably is the toughest test so far of the European Commission's codes of practice. The CPD were the kind of flagship, in some ways, initiative of disinformation in a tailored sense. It was a self-regulation initiative, and there is more coming in terms of the Digital Services Act. In some ways, it's broad, and I would want to see in my kind of narrow and pedantic research kind of question, I want to see more kind of specified and targeted public and private initiatives towards flattening the curve of misinformation and disinformation. I think, though, that COVID also shows that in certain urgent circumstances, this can also usher in acts and restrictions by governments which are punitive and disproportionate and do not follow protections that shape human rights, especially free expression, which is why you have, in certain cases, and especially now, a scope for censorial measures and restrictions that are too far. Going forward, it's a kind of, again, it's not one catch-all solution. Unfortunately, there isn't one directive or kind of oversight body that could kind of make things go away. And even if you have regulation which is in a number of different aspects effective, you know, tech usually outpaces law in many ways. So in that sense, the threats can outpace legal responses, and which is why it's so challenging, but also is why you have to have a human rights principles inform future responses. I think that I've been focusing on recently in a more kind of permanent sense, not COVID related, but having the Electoral Commission, which is for a long time it's been incoming, but I think it's allegedly coming in soon, to focus on not necessarily restrictions and certainly not criminal sanctions, but to focus on verification, research continually, oversight functions. And I think there is some scope for some positive blueprints there. Argentina have a commission for the verification of fake news, which is grounded explicitly in both journalistic collaboration with different stakeholders and media members, but also to actually ground the developments and structure of these permanent oversight functions in human rights. So obviously the more accountable framework for intermediaries is important. I think, as is shown now, but I think as has been shown for a while, especially in relation to the European Commission's assessment, which is, I guess, discerned that the codes of practice are perhaps inconsistently applied and enforced by different intermediaries, that probably creates scope for more robust regulation going forward, and probably in a more binding sense. That in itself can elicit concerns about chilling effects on free expression. If we have more binding regulation, will that cause free expression to be impeded? And will that, in many cases, either enforced by public bodies or by platforms, will that amount to censorship? I think in many ways, that's quite simplistic. It has to be a balance and trade-off, which is informed by human rights and actually does bear in mind that ultimately it isn't just kind of the marketplace of ideas, but it's actually public health. All these things can be really at risk if you don't actually have more robust structures and permanent mechanisms. I don't think that that actually has to involve around and converge on restrictions or individual censorship mechanisms. But you, at the very least, I think, have to have more robust, permanent and rights-informed institutions and oversight bodies that actually take into account the different balances here and are informed by kind of variation of human rights that has been shown in European courts. A small plug here, I do actually have a publication coming in Northern Ireland Legal Quarterly, which looks at how, in relation to the Commission coming forward that oversees elections in Ireland and will replace the current REFCON body, how you can probably balance disinformation and free expression as part of the broader goal of curtailing false information. Yeah, I mean, it's not. I would like to give a very conclusive, very erudite, expert response to this, but I mean, my final thoughts are that this is a very difficult and also evolving situation, both in terms of different and emerging platforms now constitute new fears and new threats, and they're always evolving. But I think what COVID changes is that it can actually damage lives if you have unchecked disinformation and leave those legal loopholes still open. So I think that there probably is definitely a scope for a rights-informed response that balances, for example, public health increasingly and the right to elections with free expression, which itself is never meant to be an absolute right. It says it in Article 10 of the ECHR, in both paragraph 1 and 2, and in numerous cases of the European Court of Human Rights, there's never been an intention to have an unchecked absolutist approach to free expression. I think that that's even more important to recognize as COVID-19 threatens to, via different platforms, undermine those human rights and at least kind of deliberative democratic values. Again, finally, I think that free expression, I wouldn't want to see it as shackles that restrict regulation, but a blueprint that guides it. So whether or not you kind of interpreted that with more skepticism or more optimism, I think that what you don't want to have from different stakeholders to allow is to have this right to free expression and this fear of censoring points of view to be used as a crutch to aid bad actors, essentially, to subvert values for democracy and to successfully impair different functions for democracy and undermine human rights. That's the main kind of thoughts I have on this topic, and I know it's probably in some ways convoluted, but hopefully you have a sense there where I'm at.
Thank you very much for that, Ethan. That's fascinating. I know I actually forgot to introduce myself officially at the start, but it might be useful to do so now as a kind of a framing for some of the questions that are going to come through. I used to work in law as a lawyer, and I teach media law in DCU at MA and undergraduate level. And I have a PhD in political economy of audiovisual industries. So I kind of straddle that gap between a number of the presentations here as well, between the role of public service media, the role of platforms, and the political economy of platforms, which looks at power. But I'm also really intrigued and delighted to see Ethan's legal drilling down into the actual meaning of terms that we've all been happily throwing around, like fake news, and for someone to come along and go, let's just park it there and think about what exactly this means. Law is all about really precise terms, because the meaning of cases turns on precise interpretations of concepts. I'm going to take the chair's privilege of asking the first question. And in fact, I could ask this to everybody, but obviously I'm not going to want you to shout over each other. So I think I will, if you don't mind, Eileen, can I ask you to start with it? And it is a question I developed while listening to the first talk, but it's really applicable to everybody, which is, how can we deal with this imbalance of power between the platforms and the platform economy, but particularly the social media platforms and governments as well, when social media platforms like Facebook, which I know is a really significant one, and I know that WhatsApp has a significant role as well in spreading misinformation worldwide, not necessarily in Ireland, but in other jurisdictions, particularly in Latin America, and I think in the Brazilian elections. How do we balance this power? How do we deal with this issue of an imbalance of power when it's at the level of platforms and state?
I think this is one of the strengths of the European Commission and its response, because a small state on its own isn't going to achieve very much. But even within that, there's a broader concern about this fragmentation of the internet, which has kind of already happened anyway. But the European Commission is pursuing one agenda. The US is very reluctant to follow that agenda because it hasn't done so historically. So we could potentially end up with very different things being permissible depending on where you live. But I think Ethan's legal points were really interesting, but coming back to the idea of public service media or media in general in Ireland, a huge stumbling block for Irish media is the defamation law. Yeah. So the Reporters Without Borders, who produce the annual reports on media freedom and talk about freedom of expression, it's Ireland's defamation law that they consistently point to as a major threat to freedom of expression here. And then disinformation actors use the SLAP lawsuits, so these strategic lawsuits. And in the Irish context, you know, that could be devastating. So you end up with journalists who are afraid, or they have to get legal representation themselves, even though the case is pointless, they still have to do it. And it's just the absurdity of being, I think, we're the only European country that hears these cases in front of juries. So there's lots of small actions that could be done without reaching for this really difficult question of how do you regulate platforms.
Thank you for that, Eileen. Yeah, defamation law in Ireland is really complex. For those who aren't aware of it, we do have one of the, it can be variously described as the strictest or most generous, depending which side you're coming from, defamation regimes in the world. Particularly because we have, as Eileen pointed out, we have a jury system where cases are heard in front of a jury. And you also, in Ireland, you don't have to prove actual harm. You do in the UK. It's a significant difference between the Irish and the UK defamation regimes. In Ireland, it is the potential for damage to one's reputation. And there have been really significant awards made, but it is the threat of a defamation claim. If a journalist publishes something, then their news outlet can be subject to a defamation claim, which can have significant costs. So it is a really problematic area. It is under review, so it will be interesting to see if it does change in due course. And I think that it will change for the better. There is a talk about removing jury trials from part of it, at least from the lesser claims, I think. Thank you for that, Eileen. That's really good. Fritz, do you want to address the same question then? Because I have it written on your sheet here of my little notes. What do you think about platform power and the government position towards that as well?
Yes, thank you. I think we are quite lucky because if you remember about the Cambridge Analytica that happened in UK, and our national parliament summoned Facebook twice, not just once, but twice. And the Asia Pacific regional come get summoned and testimony in the parliament. Because the Minister of the Information is really clearly stated the refusal of the Facebook will be closed and we will reject Facebook from Indonesia. And because of that kind of warning, I think it started in is the Cambridge Analytica, because the name of Indonesia is also mentioned in that part of the data that being collected. So the approach of the Facebook is a difference. So there is a question from our friends from Portugal and Spain, and they say we call Facebook, but the one that coming is their lawyers, not the real Facebook. So this happened with us. So when we discuss with the Facebook, they come and they really work with us. So they stated clearly that the platform is designed as the part of the people can communicate. So that's why we always arguing with that, what they call it, their community standard. And they also admit that the AI, whatever, how improved the AI that they created, is not able to detect the fake news. That's why the need of the people, the real people, to say this is fake news or not, even though from the government institution or from the Facebook itself, internally, is finally is the one that is able to say this is take down or not. Because Facebook is really want to protect the environment that they want. So I think because Facebook is enjoy a lot with their the money that they get through the advertising or about the political ad that they use. So I think is maybe is what we have in Indonesia is quite different with other countries. So Facebook is willing to sit with us, like during the blackout period, 3 days before the elections, Facebook agreed to turn off the ad. So there is no ad all during the 3 days before the election, starting 2018 and 2019. So there is no ad because it in order to guarantee the blackout period, and also for these elections, because we already decided that the political ad is only able to conduct it 14 days before the election, before the blackout period. They also agree with us. So I think it's starting with whether the parliament. I think the government is really need to put the big bang So like starting the enforcement. So the compliance is the Facebook is the platform is there. So the minister in information is not one or twice, and they say we're not worried to turn off the Facebook. We're not worried to turn off the Instagram. If you're not complying with us, we just turn it off. And that kind of statement is really need to be said by the government itself, because we cannot ignore the power of the power of the platform and how it's affect to the day-to-day people life.
Thank you for that. That's a really interesting answer. I'm going to move on to the next question, but Ethan and Barbara, if you want to have something to say about the platform power, of course, we'd be delighted to hear it. Barbara, there's a specific question for you about does the independent communication of the advisory bodies within a specific Irish context of COVID-19, does it increase transparency or confusion?
Well, I suppose the way you have to look at the question, I think it's an excellent question, by the way. And I know that I referenced in my talk about the messages that were coming from NPHET were against what the government basically were trying to communicate. So therefore, it got to a situation where the breakdown in the relationship was so precarious by the end of the summer that leaks began to happen, either from government sources or from NPHET themselves. There's been no definitive report about where the leaks are coming from, obviously. I would feel that if you look to, and I know that everyone's going to say, yes, you know, the stellar example of how you should handle a pandemic definitely comes from New Zealand. And if we go back even right to the beginning with the way New Zealand responses have been and how they've handled their communication, everything is just completely transparent, to the point where at one stage here we had no access to the minutes of the meeting for any of the NPHET meetings. And as I've said and tried to reinforce, I can't say it strongly enough that you really need to let people know exactly why the changes are being made, like say during the summer in relation to the restrictions and how we came off the plan early. And I think people started to get really confused then because there wasn't enough information there. So people started to demand, and as much as journalists, etc., and all stakeholders were demanding more transparency. And we know that from New Zealand, the ultimate transparency was their meetings of what would equivalent be NPHET are actually live streamed. They're online and people can, you know, look in and they know why they're coming to the, you know, they're coming to the conclusions and responses that they're choosing in relation to COVID-19. And I would see it very much so as a case of, I think it's a positive thing. I think that it's something that was bound to happen. And I think because if you look at the modelers and what they were predicting around the case numbers, etc., if things had been allowed to, you know, progress the way they were, with us remaining on level 3 and 10 days before being advised to go to level 5 immediately, the numbers that were predicted are happening and what we're seeing now and are becoming increasingly alarming for people. So I do believe that it's a positive thing, but do take into account that the majority of the people on the public health emergency team would be working doctors, some in public health, etc. And it would be their moral obligation to let people know, you know, the advice that needs to be out there in the public domain. So yeah, and I do believe that, you know, as much as, you know, reality doesn't mirror this at all, but public health decisions shouldn't be politicised. But unfortunately, we've seen public health versus the economy, even public health versus mental health has been very strong all the way through COVID-19. And political decisions will be made, hence why we came off the plan early during the summer and probably could have reached elimination of the virus by August the 20th if we'd stuck to the original plan. So I do think it's a positive thing, especially for Irish people, anybody living within the island. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Barbara. It's a kind of a sobering reminder of where we were and where we are now, I suppose. Ethan, I have a question for you now from the chat. It says, are laws strong enough to restrict government when they are in charge of defining fake news?
So I think it's a very interesting question, and I want to kind of tie in kind of 2 points here. First of all, I heard mentioned earlier on that the actual legislation for defamation here is quite kind of, in some ways, depending on how you actually target it, it's quite novel in some ways. But I think in the same way as if it's difficult to actually define whether you want to have as a standard actual harm or could cause harm as a standard, it's quite difficult to say, you know, would you impose restrictions or laws that penalize fake news, which is actually verifiably false or verifiably has caused harm? I mean, even that's quite a broad kind of stroke to actually say, because you can't necessarily define that. It's quite a kind of labor-intensive exercise to actually ascertain what the actual effects are. I think that probably, arguably, a gap I saw in my first year of my PhD is that it is quite kind of threadbare to actually have scholarship publications which show a demonstrative effect of fake news in elections, which is part of the confusion here. But I think that there have been attempts in the legislature in Ireland to draw up kind of what you might call anti-fake news law. So there was the attempted legislation brought in by Deputy James Lawless in 2017, which addressed the social media, the transparency for advertising online on social media. And I think it was in that context more kind of oriented towards dissuading people from using bot accounts and fake robot accounts. But I mean, it actually did have quite a heavy enough penalization. I think it was a few years in prison and a summary conviction for spreading false information, at least through bots. But I think that going forward, it's important that you actually clarify what you're first of all penalizing, and make sure you actually have a narrow enough framework in doing so. And you're defining in a very kind of careful and in some way limited and conservative approach to what you're actually disallowing, and more importantly, kind of having a distinction between what you're disallowing and what you're dissuading and discouraging. I think that it's in the current context, it's worth showing that what's most important to avoid is information that actually could cause public health, deterioration or undermine public health responses, especially now, or could cause harm. Also, similarly, some fake news or disinformation could actually result in kind of treatment which is targeted towards certain ethnic groups as well. Yeah. I think that probably requires more scrutiny and probably more heavy-handed enforcement than legally binding force, as opposed to, for example, misinformation which is shared by your granny online, by example. Some things just aren't necessarily in the same way as harmful. Also, I think that finally, the issue is crafting and having proportionality in the laws. And I think that we are still in quite nascent stages, that we don't really have, we have a kind of recognition that there is room for improvement here, both in the kind of electoral context and in general attitudes towards regulating and modernizing digital legislation infrastructures. But I think that at a kind of starting point, you do have to have an approach which is grounded in human rights and takes into account these principles, because it's very complex, it's very convoluted and kind of interrelated. And you do want to avoid just legislators doing that. And you want to also avoid, as they have done in France, purely pulling it out to the judiciary. So I think you have to have, at the very least, kind of pre-law scrutiny of what the law would entail, what it's oriented towards restricting. And in doing so, you have to consult, I think, journalists, human rights organizations, stakeholders, NGOs, experts as well in public policy, and I think communication too. And crucially also, which is probably overlooked at the moment, people who actually have a knowledge of how propaganda in a kind of computational sense actually works and how it affects voters. So I think it requires, at the very least, a thought out, systematic and really consulting approach before anything's introduced. And even then, you have to have, at least for the enforcement side, starting with a relatively balanced and not too extreme approach.
Thank you for that. Eileen, I know you want to jump in there on that. And I also want to ask you about the questions that's in the chat about the widespread use of the accuracy tool. So if you'd like to address all of that in the one place.
I'd just like to say that the kind of big concerns about disinformation followed a very clear narrative. So basically there's the Brexit vote, and then Hillary Clinton loses the US presidential election in 2016. And both of these things are kind of pinned on disinformation. But the problem is there's very little evidence that fake news had much influence at all on people voting in the 2016 election. They had plenty of other reasons why they voted for Trump and they didn't like Hillary Clinton. But that was the kind of impetus for, say, the European Commission in unveiling all of the projects and the work that it's done since. And what it sidestepped was the fact that, you know, a lot of disinformation for decades has been targeted on stopping action on climate change or making people doubt climate change. And these things, and Ethan mentioned harm, it's much harder to define what the harms are there. So in one instance, the electoral one gets all this attention because the democratic harms are very clear, but actually there's very little evidence of impact. And that makes sense. People for decades have been trying to study how do you influence people in elections, and what they find is it's extremely difficult. Political campaigning, it's difficult to change people's minds. On the other hand, when people are reading something about childhood vaccines causing autism, they have a very visceral reaction that says, I'm not sure if I should vaccinate my child if it's going to have these negative impacts. And you don't have to believe it. You just have to have enough suspicion to think, I won't do that. So the harm issue is a really difficult one. To answer those two questions, yeah, the first is that the tool we're developing is a browser plugin. And this is these projects, you develop prototypes of tools, they should be working, but you know, we're not a commercial company. And there are lots of other projects that are doing something similar. One of the things that the platforms could be compelled to do, or put compelled in inverted commas, is to actually unveil more of these things. So they would take a tool like ours and automatically build that in to Twitter or to Facebook. Twitter is already starting to do some of these things. You might have noticed that if you try and share something with a link, they'll send a pop-up to you to say you haven't actually clicked that link. So again, that's that idea of creating the pause before people. And then the second point is also a good one. And I would say that, well, we're not trying to dissuade people who've already gone down the rabbit hole. We're interested in the people who might be duped in the first place. And that comes back to what I was saying about there's no magic bullet, there's no quick fix. You need lots of different actions. The kind of interventions you would have for somebody who wants to be outraged all the time, or somebody who's already gone down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole, is quite different for the type of intervention you have for people who just don't want to be duped in the first place. And that's why we need lots of different projects and lots of different solutions at the same time.
Thank you for that. I'm just looking through the questions now, and thank you for addressing that. That's really interesting. There is one here that's just come in, so I'm just processing it a little bit as well. It's about thinking about a resilient public, and if governments want a resilient public, who is responsible for building this resilient public? But also a government may want a knowing, resilient public who are informed, but they may not want one that's then questioning government performance as well. So where does that balance lie? I don't know where to start with that one. I'm sorry, I know everybody could have something really interesting to think about it. So can I leave it up to the panel perhaps to see who wants to jump in first and thinking about that?
Well, I would just say very quickly that resilience is one of these buzzwords that's getting used a lot, and I think it will be around for a while. But if we're talking about resilient publics, it's a lot bigger than disinformation. It's about having a really good education system from the ground up, which isn't about disinformation at all. It's about equipping people to be able to think for themselves, having supports in there. It's about addressing inequalities. Like all of I think disinformation is a symptom of much deeper issues. And the mistake is to focus just on that and on this huge volume of dodgy online content. So resilient publics requires fairer, better societies.
Thank you. Fritz, would you like to think about this from the Indonesian perspective as well? What is the balance between education and fake news and everything else we've been discussing?
Yeah, I mean, I read the question is whether there is the right of the government also to controlling which one is fake news and which one, and what is the lies between the freedom of expressions and also protection of public orders. I mean, that question is always comes to our mind every single day when we say this is need to be taken down, this is not, this is taken down. this is not. So that feeling is always comes, whether we are acting, try to act as we have the final say, and whether it's the right of the freedom of expressions. I think one of our belief is right, because part of the democracy is freedom of expressions. I think we need to protect it, but our laws also that the freedom of expression also has a border, that the border is already stated by the law. So we are in the position that the freedom of expression is not fully that you can say whatever you want. So this is we not in that kind of statement. So with doing that, we also realize that even particularly in Indonesia, whether some phone is already installed, when you are buying the new phone, is already installed with the Facebook. And for the telecommunication company, the Facebook, Instagram is not using your internet quota. It is free. And in Indonesia also, we are massive with use WhatsApp. So maybe some country they use the Facebook or the social media, but WhatsApp group, WhatsApp is very common using by everybody. So the campaign, like we starting the campaign like think before share, or we going to the youth for try to learn understanding about before you share something, thinking whether like what the Eileen already did that. We also develop a community that become the fact checkers, and also to conduct to engage with the young fella to become more active to establish the social media literacy. So yes, we have the legal enforcement in the end. We are working with the cyber police also to do the patrol, but also we are also working in the beginning with young people and also with the public about social media literacy. But that kind of the educations, yes, we need for the long run when we are not in the election period. But when in these situations that we dealing with the pandemic, we are also dealing with the COVID-19 and the legal enforcement, and how to strict with the the existing law is something that we need to protect.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting. The point that Facebook is already installed in mobile phones when you buy them in Indonesia is horrifying in many ways. I mean, I don't know if you're aware of the or if you recall the frustration and the horror that people had when the U2 album was automatically added to everybody's iTunes, and there was outrage for this invasion of privacy. So the fact that Facebook is already there, and then it's a free way to communicate with people as well, is fascinating. Now I know Ethan wants to respond on this question about the public's responsibility or not. So Ethan, if you want to jump in, please.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, because in some ways what you're saying is it kind of incumbent on the public and the voters essentially in the election context to have a certain level of awareness and being cognizant of what the information environment in the contemporary sense actually entails. What's out there, what is worth relying on, and what is worth verifying, and what is worth distrusting. I think though, on a certain level that sounds fine, and there is a certain scope for accountability and personal incumbent need to be responsible in what you're sharing essentially. But I think that it's impossible to make that kind of a statement without saying that there also has to be a pretty robust and permanent drive to actually have people at all ages and all demographics literate in media literacy on a digital context. I think if you're saying that, look, it's on you, you can't be looking at and trusting this information. You have to avoid that and avoid sharing it. And if you don't do that and you share it, then ultimately you're complicit in this thing. I think it's quite misguided to do that, because how it works, and again, kind of part of the kind of distinction between traditional free expression and bad information and now in the contemporary context, is that often it's organized, it's structured, and it's targeted. Things like micro-targeting, things like echo chambers are kind of very sophisticated concepts that have been developed and probably accelerated in the last 20 years or so. And to essentially expect the public to understand how these things work and how they're targeted and monetized, essentially, and how their information is monetized, it's a bit like the kind of privacy argument of, if you have nothing to fear, you have nothing to hide, nothing to fear. I think at a certain level, it's a bit, I think you should be cautious in putting too much on the users and end users and consumers of information to have a certain level of veracity that they themselves have to be responsible for. Ultimately, it isn't them who's doing it. And in many cases, they aren't quite adept, as most of us aren't fully adept in how the structure of algorithms and tech platforms actually works. It's quite sophisticated. It's a big industry, of course. And as we saw in the case of Ethan, the Cambridge Analytica case, it's a very profitable industry. So I think in that sense, you should be, I think you have to have, if you are expecting public accountability and public, I guess, resilience, you do at the very least have to balance that with robust and definitely improved structures for maintaining, promoting, and improving literacy in an increasingly online context. I think.
Thank you. Eileen, I'll let you jump in there on that.
Really quick point there is that in Ireland, the vast majority of people couldn't tell you what the definition of the public sector broadcaster is, or what's the difference between the Journal and the Irish Times. You know, the one's run by a board. So while I support media literacy and I do a lot of work on media literacy, I think there's also this fantasy that we can just upskill the entire population and make them media literate. And in some ways, media literacy it's this benign option because it sounds quite good, but there's actually quite a low level of knowledge about basic media, never mind something as complicated as algorithms, as Ethan said.
Yeah, that's a really good point as well. It's a bit of a bugbear of mine that there isn't any media really taught at secondary school level. I mean, you don't do film studies directly. I think that's even a really fundamental thing of teaching people how to read a film is linked. I know I teach, as I said, I teach media law, and most of the students, even at university level in communication studies, don't really know the difference in the concepts between a public service broadcaster and a private channel or radio and who owns what. And I really enjoy kind of unpacking those things, but there are things that people should absolutely know. Ethan, your point really got me to thinking, and I was thinking about this as well, is the significance of the kind of broad shift to governance as well, and the shift from the top-down state considerations to governance theories that I think really unpack some of that complexities around individual responsibilities as well, and passing them on to people. And while individual responsibility is great, there's a limit to what individuals can do when they don't have the right information, whether it's on COVID-19, for example, or if they don't know where their news is coming from or who owns it and they don't know where to look. And I have another question, if that's okay. And this is something that I only came across this week, is that how significant WhatsApp has been as a platform for spreading fake news, if we're allowed to use that term, Ethan. I'm really worried now about misusing it. I'm sorry, your term was electoral disinformation online, so EDO, as coined by Ethan. That WhatsApp is being used, particularly, I believe, in Brazil, in the Brazilian elections, significantly. And it's not, as far as I know, certainly in my limited experience, WhatsApp is being used by my book clubs and by various groups, but I haven't had any disinformation or misinformation coming to me. And maybe I'm in the wrong groups or the right groups, but have you seen from your research, and I think this is a question for everybody as well, so have you seen from your own research that platforms like WhatsApp, which are completely effectively ungoverned or unregulated, that they are an increasing way of spreading electoral disinformation online, aka fake news? Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. I like certainly at the beginning, I'm expecting it to raise its head again, because as we go into further heavy restrictions, but certainly, I mean, this probably ties back into how people perceive risk as well. You know, it's kind of a case when people get upset, they tend to focus on negative things. I probably might be right in saying that quite a lot of fake news tends to be alarmist and, you know, has a certain agenda attached to it. So you can understand when we reach a zenith like we have this week, or, you know, we're facing into another lockdown. I've actually been quite surprised that I haven't seen more, but certainly at the start, around, you know, that we were going to have like a, you know, army on the street, curfews, etc. They certainly were spreading very much by WhatsApp at the beginning, and were highlighted very much so by the fact checking and in the journal, etc. So yeah, if there's any level of uncertainty or there's any gap for rumour, which unfortunately throughout the pandemic, we've had a government with some quite slow responses, certainly at the beginning, in relation to you know, messages targeting segmented audience, people with underlying illnesses, etc., who required specific information for them, even to the point that advertisement, you know, public advertisement on TV and radio was quite late as well. You're presenting a gap there in the communication in order for information to be put in there that isn't assessed, you know, isn't verified or validated. So yeah, I would have been aware of it.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in on that?
I think one of the issues with WhatsApp is that it's used very differently in different parts of the world. So for example, in a lot of developing countries, WhatsApp is the internet, those apps that come preloaded, because the data costs are lower. So while people in Ireland might be members of a Facebook group with the huge numbers, or you might follow a particular group, or you would only have friends maybe in your WhatsApp group. In other parts of the world, you would be in an enormous WhatsApp group where you don't know who the other people are, but you're all fans of a particular sports team or TV show or whatever. So it's just used very differently, and that's why it's more prominent there than it is here.
Thank you for that, Eileen. As I said, I didn't know that until this week. It's really interesting how, you know, I talk all the time about media and media literacy and engagement with media, and I tell students to recognize that they're in sort of their own, they have to project outside their own experience as well. And then I don't do it myself because I'm genuinely surprised that WhatsApp groups are used in that way. I think we're going to wind it up now. There's been some amazing things. I have lots of questions left, but I think I've had loads of mine answered, so I will leave it. I am inviting people to next week. There's a seminar on the 28th of October between 1 and 2 on tax ethics and multinationals. The link is, I can post it in the chat now. Oh, it's sorry, Anna has just posted it as well. That promises to be fascinating. Once again, buzzwords for me are tax. My PhD is on tax expenditures, and multinationals and platforms just sounds fantastic. So I'm just checking, apologies, the 28th is Wednesday. Thank you. So next Wednesday, there is a seminar with, it is with Emer Hunt of the UCD. She's a tax ethics lecturer. So thank you to everybody. If you have any more questions for our esteemed panel, please raise them by email or on our Facebook page and we can channel them through. I want to thank everybody for giving their time, for participating in this, for Dublin Law and Politics Review for hosting it. The forums that we have had and the seminars are amazingly informative, bring together really interesting speakers who have lots to say. And as you can see, the intersection, in fact, I've just realized I haven't given the panel members much chance to ask each other questions either, and apologies for that. But as I said, if you have a paper you want to submit to our journal by the 30th of October, we would be delighted to take that on board as well. So thank you to everybody for taking part. Thank you for those who have given their evenings to watch in and to listen in. It was really, really interesting. And the questions were amazing. There's so many different things to think about. And I know we don't have any answers, but we didn't really expect to get the answers here either. We have more questions, which is always a good way to end an academic conversation. So once again, thank you to everybody.